Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. My name's Andrew Gray. I'm your host. We are in the middle of a really exhaustive and extensive season on the subject of soul tank management, keys to avoiding burnout. And this is part 5 in that season. We've covered a lot of ground already. And just by way of quickly recapping, we've talked about 9 practical lessons for what you can do, what you can deploy as a strategy to take care of your own soul tank health and manage well and do the best job you can do to avoid burnout. Quickly recapping, those things were to audit your diary and activity, number 1. Number 2 was to insert diary margins. Number 3, learn to rest. Number 4, we found out that just stopping is not enough. Number 5, we learned that we have to refuel uniquely. And then number 6, we figured out that there are some activities that drain us more than they refuel us. And then in our most recent episode, we touched on another 3 lessons. Firstly, the orange light and the warning system that is for us in our lives. Number 8 was warning signs of bigger problems. And then lastly, the potential negative impact on relationships when you have a low soul tank. And so we've been dealing with practical lessons around soul tank management, as if to infer through the whole season that if you don't do a good job managing your soul, you're not going to go well. You might have great purpose and great direction, great opportunities and all the rest of it, but eventually, without good soul tank management, you're going to run out of fuel on the inside and you're going to end up in a bad state on the side of the road, as it were. And so today, we're going to take another look further into issues and matters that are related to soul tank management and what it means to be a healthy person in general. And so if you listened to the episode last week, you may recall that I said that in this episode, we would touch on 3 very important subjects as opposed to just lessons. And these 3 massively important subjects that we're going to deal with today are right at the heart of everything to do with personal growth and development. And the truth is that each of these subjects that I'm going to deal with in today's episode, they all deserve to be dealt with as their own season in their own right. And so that is the plan, that as you listen to this high-level description today, we will take these subjects in the future and turn them into seasons in their own right and unpack them in greater depth and give you more detail and more understanding, more insights on these subjects, what they are, how to understand them, how to learn how they affect you, and what you can do about it. So let's dive right into these 3 subjects for today. The first one is to talk about the mental health spectrum. Such a massive subject, such a hugely important topic for us to deal with. As you would know, you hear about this subject in many places on most days. Everybody knows someone that has had a challenge with mental health struggles and difficulties. Many of you listening and watching have had your own struggles, or somebody in your family or a close friend has been in that situation. It's prevalent everywhere, and it seems to be increasing. So despite our growing awareness and our improving strategies, we don't seem to be catching up just yet to the size of the challenge, but we've got to keep on working towards it. And so I want to spend some time helping to unpack what we mean by the mental health spectrum, how you can understand that, how it functions, where you may have gotten to yourself, where some of your loved ones or friends may have gotten to on this spectrum, and what we need to do as far as how to respond when we find ourselves or somebody we know finds themselves in these positions on the mental health spectrum. The first thing that I want to say is I'm not a medical doctor. And so what I'm going to share right now is not medical advice, and you don't need to take it that way, but nor is it meant to be a perfect scientific description. So let's just eradicate those first 2 thoughts. I'm not dishing out medical advice here as a certified practitioner, nor am I suggesting that the spectrum as I'm going to describe it is the only way to understand what we mean when we say mental health spectrum, but rather the things I'm going to share are guidelines and preliminary insights to help further your understanding. I'm hoping that if you can pick up at least one new truth, one new thought around this subject, you will be better equipped for your own life and those that you care about on this super important subject. Now, as I said, there's no singular accepted version of the mental health spectrum. Rather, it's a concept regarding the slide and the movement that can take place between the 2 marker points of good mental health all the way down to very poor mental health. The second thing that I want to make you aware of is that these insights that I'm going to share right now, they are based on a few things. Firstly, they're based on personal experience. In other words, as I've shared throughout this season, my own experiences dealing with the challenges that can come in the arena of our mental health. So personal experience is one thing that this is based on. The second thing is research. I've taken the time to do a lot of reading, a lot of research around this subject. My career to date has required me to do that and to be more proficient in helping people in many ways. I've wanted to do that to further my understanding and my own research into the subject. And then thirdly, the third thing that this is based on and what I'm sharing with you is it's based on more than 25 years of supporting people who themselves have struggled with mental health difficulties. And so people of all ages, all backgrounds, all kinds of situations, all manners in which they found themselves on the mental health spectrum. And my experience in that regard is very, very broad. And so I want you to understand that what I'm sharing with you here regarding the mental health spectrum is not just thoughts that I've plucked out of the sky or erroneous ideas that I have just collected randomly, but rather they're based on experience and research and being somewhat of a practitioner myself as a support person for those who have struggled with mental health. So let's get into a description of what we mean by mental health spectrum. Well, the way I want to describe it to you is to suggest that there are 5 main stages or progressive stages on the mental health spectrum, each of them connected and built on the idea that without appropriate support and intervention, an individual can slide further along that spectrum. Let's park on that for just a moment. Each of these milestones or marker points or stage descriptors that we're going to talk about with the mental health spectrum, every one of them is connected to the other. And it's a very important idea to grasp that unless people receive the kind of support they need and the intervention that they sometimes need, it's very easy for them to travel from the place that they're at to a more challenging location on this spectrum. So let's start off with stage 1, which I would like to call the catalyst, or you could describe it as something that kickstarts the process. The catalyst, or something that kickstarts the process or the journey for people on the mental health spectrum. Let me give you a few ideas of what kind of things can be a catalyst and send people further down the mental health spectrum. Firstly, a crisis. When people experience a crisis in their life, it can act like a catalyst that sends them into a spiral mentally and emotionally. Secondly, a trauma. We would differentiate there by saying that a crisis typically happens in circumstances and a trauma is deeply personal. It could be something like the death of a loved one or something else. A major trauma that happens in people's lives can be a kickstarter on the mental health spectrum. Other things like loss of employment, that brings with it all kinds of fears and worries and can be a starter point for struggles for people mentally. Another one is the end of a significant relationship, whether that's a spouse or a long-term friend. The end of an important relationship can be a catalyst that kickstarts people on the mental health spectrum. Also, we need to understand that a physical health issue could be another challenge. When people get a medical diagnosis that is difficult to handle or concerning or very worrying for them, that in itself can kickstart people, become a catalyst for their journey on the mental health spectrum. I want to get into a second category of catalysts or kickstarters, and that is when people have long-term bad habits. Let me talk about the obvious ones to begin with. If you have bad habits in the arena of your sleep patterns, your food and nutrition, your exercise or lack of it, that is probably going to be a contributing factor in what can cause you to also kickstart the journey on the mental health spectrum. Sometimes behaviors, addictive type of behaviors, such as an addiction with alcohol or gambling or even food. These kinds of behaviors can be the starter point for people journeying along the mental health spectrum. Even a serious screen addiction, constantly on the phone, constantly in front of the computer. Screen addictions can be another reason why our mental health declines. And there are other factors as well that act like catalysts and kickstarters. First of all, there can be family history. In other words, we understand that when generationally there's been mental health challenges in the family line, that often can be a contributing factor for people in the present for why they struggle. Another big one that we have to give validity to is the neurochemistry imbalance that people face. In other words, we are strongly inferring, and science and research has proven this a long time ago, that the chemical balance in the brain can get out of whack from where it needs to be, and that in itself can be the cause for people to move into a bit of a slide on the mental health spectrum. Nothing that they've particularly done, nothing that they could have changed necessarily, but their neurochemical balance is out of order and it causes challenges. Another one that's pretty common is pregnancy and postnatal struggles. Many women will find that when they have been through a difficult pregnancy or after they've given birth in those first few months, which those who have children here, you know how tiring that can be, that in itself can be a catalyst for kickstarting a journey along the mental health spectrum. Let me touch on one more very nuanced one, which is rarely discussed or even understood, and that is life purpose undiscovered. In other words, one of the keys to fulfillment and joy in life is to understand what your shape is, what your wiring is. One person put it this way, and that is two important days in your life: the day you were born and the day you find out why. Well, that second thought there, to discover your purpose, how you're gifted, what you're meant to do with your life, that's an incredible source of joy and fulfillment if you can discover your wiring and your purpose and find yourself in contexts where you're using what you're gifted with to make your contribution to the world. Well, I'm inferring strongly that when people are not helped to discover that purpose in their life, that inactivated purpose can be a source or a catalyst for people having mental health challenges because they lack a fulfillment and a simple joy that should come from knowing their place and their part in the story. All of these things and many more that we could have listed can become like catalysts and kickstarters in a person's life on the mental health spectrum. The point of knowing all of these things is to be aware. That's the point. We don't have to debate which ones are more challenging than others. The point is to be aware that all of these factors can play a part, and we've got to be on guard for ourselves and for others. So, recapping that, stage one on the mental health spectrum is about the catalysts, the kickstarters that can begin a person's journey along this spectrum. Let's get to stage two, which is very common, often is used as a very broad sweeping headline, but I want to define it a little further today to increase our understanding. Stage two is what we would call depression and anxiety. Now, I want to put a little descriptive sentence behind that heading of depression and anxiety because it's often misunderstood, or it's simply used as a broad sweeping statement to cover all of the challenges associated with mental health. And really, it's a little bit too opaque. It's not really targeted enough to help us understand what this is, particularly as it pertains to the mental health spectrum. We want to position it here as the very next stage after those catalysts and those kickstarters that we just discussed. Depression and anxiety more than feeling flat or discouraged. Now, there are some personalities and some people in life, and you would have heard them, you would have met some of them, you might have some living in your own home. And the way that they like to respond to hearing about people who struggle with depression and anxiety is to simply try and tell them they need to toughen up. Or they say things like, yeah, everybody has a bad day, everyone feels low from time to time. Well, that statement in isolation is true, that everybody has a bad day occasionally and that everybody feels low from time to time. But we are not trying to equate those descriptors to this second stage on the spectrum of what we call depression and anxiety. They are not the same thing. And that's why I'm very strongly pointing out the fact that when we say depression and anxiety, we are talking about something that is more than feeling flat or discouraged. It's more nuanced than that. It's deeper than that. And it's got to be understood and unpacked, especially if we have enough regard for helping people to not travel from stage 2 to stage 3 along this spectrum, which is so, so vital. So let's describe depression and anxiety just a little bit. Well, first of all, we are talking about a loss of motivation. We're talking about a loss of will. You might recall, if you've been listening to this whole season, that we started out by describing that the soul is made up of the mind, the emotions, and the will. In other words, our will is that ability to engage with life, the ability and the energy to engage with people and activities and purpose and all of these things. When a person struggles with depression and anxiety, it becomes very, very difficult for them to engage their will. Motivation decreases significantly, as does willpower, and along with it goes a shrinking social capacity. Now, I'm not talking about a low social capacity by personality. There are people who do not like to be the life of the party, do not want to be around other people 24/7. That's a personality trait, and that has its own validity. But I'm talking here about when people struggle with depression and anxiety, one of the indicators will be a shrinking social capacity, lower now than they used to be, an inability to engage. And ultimately, when people experience depression and anxiety, they start to experience anxiety about an increasing number of situations. Many times they will experience anxiety attacks. Now, if you've ever had an anxiety attack, you know how unsettling that experience can be. At times, their physical state will also respond, and they will experience heart palpitations, heavy sweating, a sense of panic, a fierce desire to escape the situation. And the thing we've got to understand about this is what some people are experiencing almost on a daily basis. Now, one of the things that we can do and we can encourage others to do in this situation is to try to take a little control of the things that are somewhat controllable. In other words, it's always valid to try and gain mastery over nutrition and sleep and exercise, particularly at this stage of the spectrum. Now, depending on how challenging a person is finding this stage, that's not always possible. If it was so easy to deploy these solutions, then everybody would be doing it. I want to acknowledge the fact that it's not always easy for people to find handles on the things that they know they should be getting a grip on. But where possible, we want to encourage people to pay attention to these practical disciplines, getting some sunlight, watching what they eat, trying to get the right sleep patterns in order, getting some daily exercise. These things can help to arrest the slide of the mental health spectrum when people get to stage 2. I'm certainly not suggesting it's the entire answer. For many people, it's not, but it will help to some degree. The second thing that we want to take a serious look at when people get to stage 2 on the mental health spectrum is we want them to make contact with a trusted GP or local doctor, someone that they believe understands the mental health spectrum and can have a conversation with them about what could be next for them to get the support that they need. We shouldn't ignore these early warning signs. We certainly shouldn't just sweep over them with a broad brush and say, yeah, well, we all have a tough time. Everybody's under pressure. Get over it. That is not the answer. That's not how it works. And in fact, when you respond to a person who is at stage 2 on this spectrum with that kind of language, your harshness can actually push them at an increasing speed towards stage 3. So we've got to be careful with what we say. We've got to be smart with our words. And where possible, we've got to increase our own understanding if we actually want to be helpful for those who are having these struggles. And so before we get to stage 3, I want to reinforce another time something that's been a key point throughout this whole season, and that is that holistic diagnosis is crucial. You cannot just diagnose mental health in isolation. It's a very poor process for any kind of professing practitioner to be engaging with. In other words, you can't just deal with the mental health challenge and spectrum in the silo of mental health. Why? Because what we have discovered, particularly from point 1, is that there are many sources or catalysts or kickstarters that can get people moving along this spectrum. But secondly, we need to understand that when people have mental health challenges, it won't stay quarantined in the arena of their mental health and the mental faculties of their life. It will wash over into their emotional life, their physical life, their relational life, their spiritual life. It will affect all these other arenas. And so we need holistic diagnosis, particularly when we're trying to understand mental health challenges, because the fact of the matter is, if it only had the entry point of a person's mental state, and if it was quarantined only to their mental well-being, well, you could target it in a very specific, quarantined kind of fashion. But the truth is, there are multiple entry points. People can have mental health challenges because of stuff that enters their life through their emotional world, relational world, physical world, multiple entry points. And secondly, there are multiple ripple effects. In other words, what starts in one facet of a person's life does not necessarily remain in that facet alone. And we've got to be aware of that reality. Let's get to stage 3 on the mental health spectrum as I'm describing it in this particular episode. Stage 3, we are calling paranoia and hypervigilance. In other words, when people struggle in stage 2, don't get the support they need, don't get the intervention and or the medical help that they need, and are not able to recover some level of control and mastery and strength back into their world, and they continue to slide down this spectrum, people will often end up at stage 3, paranoia and hypervigilance. When people get to this stage, they begin to become persuaded that they are being watched, that they are being assessed, that their personal security and the personal security of their loved ones is at risk. Now, for people who have never been there, nor known a person who has been there, this can seem difficult for you to accept that it's a reality for people. I want you to try and lean in and trust experience and research to know that this is a very real state that people get to. It's not something they're fabricating. It's not something that lives in their imagination, but rather it's a daily lived experience when their mental health slides beyond depression and anxiety into a deeper state. This is where people get to. They become obsessive about their security. They become obsessive about checking the locks on the doors in the house, making sure the windows are closed, the alarm is off, checking on their children, hypervigilance about what's going on in their world, because this obsessive behavior is reflecting the fact that there is a desperate need for control measures. We need to understand that at these stages of mental health on the spectrum, people are struggling, but they are aware of the nature of their struggle. And so they are still very much coherent and present in the middle of their struggle. And it's like a sensation of drowning in a pool and nobody knows you're there. And so in this state of paranoia and hypervigilance, people will be looking for handles on anything that they feel like they can get some kind of control over, because nearly everything else in their life feels like it's spiraling out of control. And so hypervigilance in an obsessive way begins to take a hold of their behavior and how they're functioning. Further to that, they become seriously blurred in their perspective on reality. They start to believe that things are happening that are not happening. They begin to believe that people, as I said, are watching them and assessing them and judging them when people may have not even looked across their side of the street, but this becomes their blurred sense of reality. And at this stage of the mental health spectrum, neurochemistry imbalance begins to bear significant influence. I'm going to say that again because it's very, very important for us to understand that at stage 3 of the mental health spectrum, paranoia and hypervigilance, at that stage, neurochemistry imbalance begins to have significant influence on the individual. In other words, the thing that was becoming unstable chemically in their brain has now begun to accelerate. And the point is, they actually need professional, expert medical intervention at this stage to help arrest the slide. Because as scary as this stage can be for people, and it is, and for their loved ones, it becomes deeply disconcerting. But at this stage, the truth is there is further that they can travel and things can actually get worse. And so people need to understand when this behavior is going on, professional medical intervention really needs to be brought into the scope of things as fast as possible to help this person to arrest the slide and begin their journey of recovery back to good mental health and stability. Let's talk about stage 4. And these final 2 stages really are quite frightening, but we have to talk about them. We have to have understanding about them. We have to get our own thinking brought into the light so that we can understand what could happen in our own life or somebody in our family or a close friend. The more we understand, the more we are prepared for helping with the right advice if the time requires it. Stage 4 on the mental health spectrum is what we call psychosis. Now, when we talk about psychosis, we're talking about the fact that their ability to engage personal relationships is holding on by a thread, and their perspective on reality is all but gone. Now, remember a moment ago in stage 3, we talked about the fact that perspective on reality begins to be quite blurred, and assessments and conclusions are being made that are not based on any kind of substantiated reality. Well, in stage 4 in psychosis, that goes up several notches, that people really have lost their grip on most of what is going on with reality. Anxiety and paranoia at an all-time high when it comes to psychosis, struggle to sleep without serious medication, and relentless declarations of what is perceived around the individual, which are not based in reality. Psychosis is a very scary mental state that people get into where they seem almost 24/7 incoherent. And their conclusions and statements about what's going on around them in reality is almost like it's out of some kind of sci-fi movie because it's so detached from the reality of what's actually going on. It's a very serious stage for people to get to. An expert medical diagnosis, number one, and intervention, specialist hospitalization generally is what is required for people when they get to this stage 4 of psychosis, where literally their hopes for recovery and re-strengthening are holding on by a very thin thread. They need intervention of a medical specialist nature very, very quickly so that they don't slide to the 5th stage on the spectrum. And that stage is what we call schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is an apparent complete loss of person and personality, a complete loss of person and personality. And at this stage of the mental health spectrum, the neurochemistry of an individual is extraordinarily scrambled, unbelievably out of whack, seriously worrying about where this person's life is going to go at this stage, and their ability to engage with reality and relationships has completely vanished. And so where we said in stage 4 psychosis, things are holding on by a thread. Well, in stage 5 schizophrenia, those threads have all but snapped. And what we begin to see is fantasy, delusion, and even cognitive fragmentation. In other words, the person beginning to segment their mind and their thoughts into different experiences of manufactured personality and a real loss of person, as I described at the top of this stage. Now, I've had conversations in the past with people who are experts in this arena, and I do recall one particular conversation that is still very vivid in my mind, where I was speaking with the professor of a specialist unit for mental health support and somebody who had spent decades in the arena of helping people on these deeper stages of the mental health spectrum. And I'll never forget hearing them quote something in regards to schizophrenia and how serious it is. And I'll quote for you now what this particular person, this professor, said to me was that when people get to stage 5 schizophrenia, and I quote, "We are rarely able to get people back from this stage." So I know that's alarming to listen to, and it's alarming to talk about. But the point of talking about these serious stages is we want to be well informed, well prepared to help people arrest their slide on this spectrum and hopefully never ever get to stage 4 and stage 5, because at this stage of diagnosis, stage 5, a person is most definitely hospitalized at this point and at serious risk of never recovering a normal life experience. Now, it does happen that people do recover from this state, but not as often as we would like to believe or hope. If people get to stage 5, their chances of recovering good mental health are very, very slim. Slightly better at stage 4, certainly better at stage 3, still very, very good at stage 2. And at stage 1, that's the ultimate stage, to be surrounded by good friends, loved ones who have a good support network, who are well informed, well researched, well advised, to keep a close eye to make sure that people don't take their slide down this mental health spectrum. I want you to take on board that advice and really not be troubled by it as much as I want you to be empowered by it, because I want you to understand more about what we actually mean when we use this broad sweeping statement of mental health, to understand the stages that are involved in the mental health spectrum, so that you can become a great friend, a great family member, someone who can support a person who potentially is in the early stages of that slide, be a part of their rescue and their recovery. I want to move on to a second high level subject here that, as I said at the top of the episode, this will form the backbone of a season in its own right in due course. And that is, I want to talk to you about what I call the self-awareness muscle. The self-awareness muscle. In other words, behavioral science turned inward. Really, the understanding of why do we do what we do the way we do. Why does this matter? Well, this matters because if we don't understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, where it's coming from, we are ill-equipped to face the challenges of our tomorrow. If we don't understand what's going on in our thoughts and our emotions and our history as we approach new challenges, new opportunities, new relationships, we will be operating in somewhat a random fashion when actually there are great truths to be discovered if we start to grow our self-awareness muscle. I want to talk in an example or an analogy of how I've trained people for many, many years on this subject of self-awareness. I want you to imagine that your activity, your behavior in social settings is a little bit like the spikes and the patterns on an ECG chart where a heartbeat is tracked, and you see this consistent rhythm on the graph and on the chart where the heartbeat is giving off a regular rhythm. I want you to imagine that that chart or that graph is representative of your behaviors, your activities, your thoughts, your emotions, your conversations in social contexts and in your daily activity. And every now and then, on the odd occasion, we experience a huge spike on that graph, something that's out of rhythm, something that's not the regular pattern. Now, that could be a reflection of a moment of embarrassment, a moment of shame, a moment of fear, a moment of great worry and concern or panic, but it's something that is not our normal rhythm, our normal function. I want to urge you to change your response to that kind of moment, because typically what happens when people experience a sudden spike on their graph to do with embarrassment or fear or worry because of a certain situation that they're facing, typically what happens for most people is their reflex muscle kicks in, and as quickly as possible they try to bury that thing and suppress it and push it down, keep it under wraps so that it can't become visible. Now, I understand the rationale behind why people want to do that. However, what's happening when people suppress and push down in that manner, they are missing incredible opportunities for understanding and growth and development and becoming a whole new person if they learn what's going on in that moment. I've taught people for many years that those moments, those spikes on the graph, they are opportune moments for us to stop for half a beat, say to ourselves, when I get home, when I get out of this situation, I'm going to spend time thinking about that spike on the graph and ask myself some important questions. Let's take embarrassment for a moment. If you find or you've had the experience where you suddenly got embarrassed in a situation because of something you did or something you said or something somebody else said, and you felt that flushing feeling of getting blotchy on the neck and feeling like you were sweating and everybody was staring at you, I understand that's an uncomfortable moment. However, there is also some gold under the surface of that moment if you're brave enough. So that's why I'm encouraging you in that moment not to quickly try and suppress and move on and get beyond it as quickly as possible and hope to never think about it ever again. That's such a lost opportunity. What you need to do is take a half a beat and say, right, that was weird. That was uncomfortable. I didn't enjoy it, but I'm not going to miss the lesson that's in it later on. I'm going to ask myself some important questions. And those questions are, why did I respond that way? Why did I get so flushed with embarrassment? Where did that come from? What's causing me to feel uncomfortable in that situation? Here's why we want to do this, because if we can learn to dig instead of burying, we will discover that there is gold truth to learn about ourselves, why we do what we do, the way we do it, when we do it, because underneath some of that dirt that we've been burying our feelings under is some gold truth about who we are and the opportunity to change some things, to fix some things, to recover some things, so that as we move forward into new opportunities, new challenges, new relationships, in our future. We will be better prepared in our tomorrow because we will have resolved the source of where some of those spikes and those anomalies came from, so that we are becoming more and more of our maximized potential rather than just sticking with status quo, using the wet blanket, suppressing all of those moments instead of learning. And so the self-awareness muscle is vital in the arena of growth and development. If you want to become the best version of yourself and understand how to be adept in all situations, regardless of who's present, regardless of what's going on, regardless of what's at stake, you can become that person who is calm in any moment because you've learned to do the digging instead of the burying and grow that self-awareness muscle that all day, every day, you can understand. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Where's it coming from? Am I happy with it? Should I change it? Should I fix it? Or is it something that I want to keep on embellishing because it's good for me? The self-awareness muscle, we will get into that at a deeper level in a future season, no doubt. The third high-level subject that I want to get to in this episode today, before we run out of time, is a huge one. This probably warrants a 10-episode season or something of the like because it's such a big subject. I'd like to skim the mountaintops of it, but still try to give you some handles on your understanding and hopefully some early stage handles on strategy for what to do. I want to talk about escaping manipulative relationships. Escaping manipulative relationships. What do we mean when we say manipulative relationships? Well, I want to describe it this way: very generalized, but also very profound. Existing in a manipulative relationship means the loss of power and control to another person. Loss of power and control to another person. Now, it happens in every kind of relationship. It happens with employers and employees. It happens with spouses. It happens with parents and children, even sometimes when the children are full-grown adults. It happens in friendships. It happens in sports teams, community groups. It's not good that it happens. We don't want to see it happening, but it does happen in every kind of relationship in all kinds of contexts. One of the things we see most often is we see dominant personalities taking advantage over vulnerable or fragile personalities. Now, remember that descriptor I gave you at the start, the loss of power and control to another person, which is to infer that as a human being, there is a measure of power and control that should always be with you. There is no such relationship anywhere in the world where a person ought to surrender all of their power and all of their control to another. I'm going to get into that a little more in a moment, but that's what we're talking about when we talk about manipulative relationships, the loss of power and control to another person. Here's another way to describe what we mean by manipulative relationships. We're talking about the stealing, S-T-E-A-L-I-N-G, the stealing, the robbery, the stealing of the will. A moment ago, you might recall that we talked about our will being part of our soul, that part of us that is how we engage, it's how we make decisions, it's how we choose, it's how we interact with what we want to do with our life. Well, manipulative relationships at their core are all about stealing the will or the willpower of another individual. And the truth is, hundreds of millions of people are suffering this at some level around the world. Now, why are they still continuing to suffer? Well, there's a whole host of things I could say about that. But one of the reasons why there's so many people suffering this kind of relationship is, firstly, no understanding. People haven't had someone experienced and wise enough to explain to them that they are actually in a unhealthy, manipulative relationship with another person. And so they just believe it to be the status quo and they continue to roll on and cope the best they can. Lack of understanding. Secondly, no empowerment to get free. One of my greatest joys in life is to help people get free or escape from manipulative relationships. They're unhealthy, they're destructive, and at their worst expression, they're downright wicked. And I want people to experience life lived, liberated and free from the wickedness of somebody else trying to steal their power and their control and their will. But millions of people continue to suffer because of a lack of understanding and a lack of empowerment, which means training and ability to get free. As I mentioned a moment ago, there is no such thing as a healthy relationship where manipulation is at the center. If manipulation is involved, health is diminished. Let me talk to you for a moment about the journey of an individual becoming a manipulative person. Now, there's many factors that we could talk about, and if we were in this season already, we would talk about them in great detail. However, I want to talk to you about one of the reasons why a person becomes a manipulative person and expresses that behavior in all of the relationships that they have in life. It basically is a progression or a sequence of events in their formative years, typically, that looks something like this. First of all, it starts with an absence of role modeling. In other words, when a person is born into a family where there isn't any healthy relationships on display, there aren't healthy boundaries being role modeled, but rather there is manipulation and control and abuse and misuse of others. When that's happening, this child that comes into this family has an absence of good, healthy role modeling. That's the first thing that can happen in a person's life when they journey towards becoming a manipulator themselves. The second major factor is that that person, again, in their formative years, usually, and when I say usually, I mean most often, most of the time, experiences some kind of trauma or brokenness. Now, I could write you a long list, but let me give you some of the more common traumas and brokenness experiences that happen in the early stages of the life of someone who goes on to become a manipulator. One of the most common traumas that people experience that causes them to progress this way is some form of sexual interference in their young life. When a child is sexually interfered with, it creates a breach of boundary and a breach of trust that becomes a trauma point in their life because they are not wired in any way, shape, or form to cope with that kind of breach of boundary that should never, ever happen. It's a trauma experience. Another experience that happens for lots of people is a breakup of the family when the parents get divorced or one parent leaves without warning and never returns, or when there's the death of a loved one in the family. These moments of trauma and brokenness, and just from the 3 or 4 that I've listed there, you can easily figure out that we're talking hundreds of millions of people that experience these kinds of traumas and brokenness. When that happens, typically the reflex muscle in the soul of the individual who suffers that trauma and that brokenness is they look at the scenario they've just been through, they assess the context that they're now living in as a result of that trauma or that brokenness, and deep on the inside, they make an inner vow or an inner promise to themselves that they will never allow such a trauma, such a brokenness, such a trust breach to happen in their life ever again because of the pain and the hurt that they've experienced. It's an understandable response in every measure. However, it's not a healthy one that points people in the right direction, because what happens usually after these inner vows and these inner promises is that this person, even at a very young age, in their soul, at a very deep level, begins to reach for control and to rectify their loss of power. Again, we understand it. We have great empathy for it, but it's setting them on course for living their life in an unhealthy and destructive way. So what happens is absence of role modeling, trauma and brokenness, promises made to oneself on the inside, reaching for control and redeeming that loss of power. And then the next thing that happens is that people begin to attempt to cope with their trauma and their brokenness. And the most common coping mechanism that we see in people is the manipulation of others. There are other coping mechanisms that I could describe and talk about, but they're not for today's episode. I want to focus here on what is probably the most common coping mechanism that people will begin to deploy, and that is the manipulation of others as a means to try and regain some power and control in their life when they've had their own power and their own control stripped away through trauma and brokenness. Now, when people begin to utilize this coping mechanism, it's often a mixture of conscious and subconscious. It's not always vindictive and horrible and wicked and deliberate. Sometimes it's at a very, very deep level where they don't even know they're doing it. However, it's one of the most common mechanisms for coping that we see people reach out and deploy. And then what happens after they commence using manipulative tactics, trying to get power and control off others to attempt to restore the deficiency in their own loss of power and control, what happens is that person, again, can happen at a young age, they get the reinforcement of the feedback loop. In other words, they have chosen to manipulate. They use that tactic on other people. They get the response from other people that they were hoping for, and the lesson comes full circle that if you manipulate other people, it's a means for getting what you want in this life. It's incredibly unhealthy, very destructive for everybody that touches. But for people who are broken by trauma and other issues in their life, when they are searching for a way to cope, when they're looking to restore control and power, and they see this feedback loop working for them, it becomes an addictive cycle that can be very hard to break without awareness and understanding and intervention. Typically, what we see is when people exist this way for a long enough period of time in their life, into adulthood particularly, we see that they can, not always, but they can become predatorial in relationship selection. In other words, because they learn that this coping mechanism of manipulation works well to get them what they want and the things that they feel they need, they begin to seek out relationships with other people who are vulnerable and fragile and what we might describe as a bit of a pushover, because it's easy to get them to cower and to surrender and curtsy and hand over power and control to the more dominant personality. A little wise warning here for those of you who, as you're building new friendships with people on the journey of life, beware of flattery. Why beware of flattery? Because often flattery is the early stage warning sign of the real deal that's coming behind it, which is manipulation. When people try to butter you up with sugary, sweet, over the top, excessive flattery, I want you to learn to dismiss it, because flattery is not encouragement. And if you've got an encouragement deficiency in your soul, you need to be extra careful about people who try to smother you with flattery. I would suggest to you, number one, it's not going to do you any good because it's false and it's fake and it can't actually put a deposit in your soul. But secondly, beware, because after flattery could come the claws of manipulation, and you need to be on guard. The self-perpetuating cycle of manipulation happens because the monster gets bigger. In other words, this feedback loop that we talked about, where a person wanting control from others continues to snatch that power and that control from others. They learn that that system works, and the monster of manipulation on the inside gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You can see it in all spheres of life, as I said, and you can see it with emotional and conversational pressure. Typically, it plays out with various kinds of threats and intimidation, cold silences, ultimatums, cold shoulders, where people will use the commodity of their emotions, which are unpredictable, volatile, and a little bit to be in fear of. They use their emotional responses and their moods to coerce others to cooperate into appeasing them. When you've got a relationship in your life where emotional manipulation is constantly going on, you need to understand you're already in the whirlpool of manipulation that is becoming stronger in your life. Cold silences, intimidations, threats about how somebody will respond if they don't get what they want. All of these behaviors are forms of manipulating others in order to get what they want. Now, one of the most common examples we see of this is typically in young children and toddlers. Now, we're not so bothered by this entirely because they're toddlers. They're babies. They're immature. They don't understand. They're in a process of being taught that you can't just have everything you see. Go through the shops, see it, want it. If I don't get it, I chuck a tantrum. That's the behavior of an immature child or a toddler. But what happens when those same sorts of behaviors are happening in a teenager, a young adult, or a full-grown adult who is continuing to behave with cold silences, moods, intimidations, threats, all kinds of ultimatums when they don't get what they want from other people? Well, when you see that, we're no longer talking about immaturity and lack of development. We're talking about deep, deep manipulation at play, and it's going to damage everybody that it gets near. Now, one of the things that we will talk about in a future season when we talk about escaping manipulative relationships, but I just want to highlight it now, is the fact that there is no freedom from manipulation without confrontation. There is no freedom from manipulation without confrontation. But I'm going to take the time to unpack that, what that looks like, how it correlates to healthy boundaries, and how you can actually escape manipulative relationships and live with the joy and freedom that that brings when you don't have people in your life anymore trying to steal your power, steal your will, and control you because of their brokenness and deficiency. I hope that's been helpful today. In our next episode, I've got a special guest coming up. We're going to discuss all kinds of things from soul tank management to mental health first aid to emotionally healthy leadership in organizations and all kinds of other subjects that I think you're going to enjoy. Hope you've enjoyed today's episode touching these three massively important subjects we talked about. Also, if you'd like to hear more from me, I'd love you to sign up to my newsletter, and you can do that by going to andrew-gray.ck.page/profile. I'll put that in the show notes so that you can click on that, get a hold of my weekly newsletter, find out every time there's a new guest on the podcast or a new season beginning, and get some more insightful thoughts and tips from me on a weekly basis. But that's all we got time for in this episode. Until next time, bye for now.